Let's talk VDML with KJR.
Welcome to Let's Talk VDML, practical conversations about trusted AI adoption. This podcast is brought to you by KJR, Australia's trusted advisor in software quality engineering and AI innovation. I'm Kelvin, and I'm the founder of KJR. In each episode, we dive into the challenges and opportunities of responsible AI adoption, governance, and assurance with industry experts and thought leaders. If you enjoy the conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected. Today, it's exciting. We've got Michael Tremere here for a chat. Michael's AI Global Black Belt at Microsoft, and you work with your Azure customers for building out AI solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, welcome.
No worries.
Yeah,
Thanks
good
for
to
having
have
me,
you.
Kelvin.
Yeah, good. We've been waiting to have this chat for a while. Michael, tell us about your role and how did you get there and things like that.
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing machine learning and AI for about 7 years now, starting with doing some research in the medical space years ago. Worked at a consultancy for a few years doing all different types of machine learning, from sort of vision to, again, a lot of medical, a lot of NLP, forecasting, reinforcement learning, you name it.
Yep.
And then worked at a startup doing financial services stuff and sort of automating loan decisioning and things like that and forecasting. And then I've been at Microsoft for coming up on 2 years later this year. So
awesome.
So at Microsoft, I work mostly large enterprise customers and large startups globally. Essentially, I'm a pre-sales engineer. So for customers who are, looking to build things on Microsoft Azure, helping them architect their solutions, giving them just sort of best practices, and when things get a bit sticky and difficult, that's often when I'll get called in and help them, build and whether it's actually writing code or just helping, giving them the guidance and doing workshops for them. So
cool.
Just
we wrote that paper together with Shane Nanayakara, and that only seems like yesterday.
But
that was early days when Chap just got was out in the market, right, for looking at explainability of some of the AI decision models.
That's right, back in 2018. So
that long ago.
but I guess in the context of what we'll chat about today, from the very beginning, a big focus of mine has always been explainability of the models, reliability, things like that, which particularly today maybe doesn't get as much airtime as it should. Always been an interesting thing, and it doesn't feel like that long ago now, does it?
No. But lots has happened since then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like 2 or maybe 3 years ago, ChatGPT really exploded, and now the LLM stuff seems to be driving so much, right? It's
and it does feel definitely, especially with different customers that I work with and different teams. There's a lot of some teams I talk to full of traditional machine learning engineers. I guess more akin to my background, and depending on the domain they work in. If they work a lot in forecasting or vision problems, maybe they don't use large language models a lot, and then you might talk to other customers and it's they're AI engineers, that's all they do, and they don't have any background in traditional machine learning. So you see a lot of this play out when it comes to things like evaluation and, going from POC to production, you start to see the differences in experience, come out. So it is interesting what's happening in the industry.
And in terms of what industry's really starting to move forward with, is it RAG models? Is the agentic stuff starting to take off? What seems to be driving some of the business solutions, or is it a bit all over the place with different things?
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on the industry. I think if you look at financial services and resources and industries that have typically had, I guess quants and actuaries and data scientists for decades, they've still got a lot of stuff, particularly forecasting and stuff like that, where they aren't using LLMs to do that, and they're using traditional models, and but now they're also adding large language models, particularly in productivity. I think with generative AI, that's sort of often the first cab off the rank, and it's actually serving the general business users, helping them find information. I think most businesses that I've worked with, the first thing they do is an internal chatbot. Often it's for customer service teams to just helping them find information, formulate responses, and making them more efficient.
Yeah.
But I think part of that though is because there haven't been many turnkey solutions that make it super easy and that just work.
Yeah.
As much as the marketing might say that, I think it's only in the last 6 months or so that the tooling, not just from a company like Microsoft, but across the board, where it's starting to become, a lot more comprehensive, where it's got all the extra tools that you need. So I think there's a lot of POCs out there. I think only now we're seeing a lot of companies that are actually starting to get more than a couple use cases and starting to accelerate how quickly they can develop.
Yeah. Well, definitely, I think we're seeing a bit of a different development paradigm coming through, a bit like the Carpathy Software 2.0 but we've always been sort of lacking a bunch of that final bit of tooling and getting the DevOps sort of pipeline really mapped out for this style of development, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's half a dozen different ops now. There's agent ops, there's rag ops, there's ops everything. But it's interesting because I guess DevOps has been a thing, because you need repeatability. You need, you need approvals to make sure that if a change happens, that when it needs to be approved by the right person to go to production and get scaled out. This has been a problem in machine learning for years, right? And there's a reason ML ops exists as something different. There's a few extra differences, but it's still really about making sure that something works before you go off and put it in the wild. And I think definitely the last couple of years, or the first couple of years since ChatGPT was released, it was something that would get talked about. But time and time again, I've seen, some of Australia's largest companies that, investing a lot into generative AI and building things, and putting a lot of money behind it, hiring a lot of people, but often just getting a little bit lazy when it comes to evaluation, when it comes to how do I operationalize this thing and make it, automate it, and make sure that I've got the right controls on there. There's been a few times I've got a call or an email, sort of an urgent one saying, hey, someone just discovered, that they can jailbreak our chatbot, or that it's got this vulnerability, like how do we fix it? And really, if they had have just read the 101 documentation to say, look, turn on the filtering, turn on the jailbreak protection, they probably wouldn't have happened. But for some reason it slips through the cracks.
How many years have been working on web apps and we still get command injections
and
things
totally.
like that, right? It's
totally.
I think that's always just staying on top of that side. Interesting going, I find a lot of people struggle to go from a POC to production. Like, what's that gap, and sort of the confidence to really understand that. And I guess in my head, a lot of the times it's them really understanding what's good enough to begin with, like what's that baseline, what's that metric. But many people don't start that POC with that sort of thought about, well, where should the bar be set and what do we need to get to and how do we evaluate across that? How have you found that getting from a POC to production sort of thing?
It's interesting. You see a big difference. The teams that their first foray into AI is generative AI. Often, it's quite common where you ask them, okay, like, all right, we're doing this project, especially because I might come in to help when something's already underway. And often I'll say, all right, what are the metrics we're trying to hit? Like, what's our baseline, whether it be the humans that are doing something at the moment, or, what's the sort of, where's the business value? And often there's just no answer. And I think it's not something that should take that long to do. Often it might only take a few hours, a couple of days to talk across the business and understand what is good enough, what are the things we need to look out for. But it's a little bit surprising how often that doesn't really happen properly. And that really should be the North Star. When you're doing any sort of project that isn't deterministic, or just any project in general, you need to know, all right, is this actually bringing value? And I think particularly with the craze of AI, where, since I started in machine learning, doing this sort of stuff in 2018, which is a long time ago now, it's always been a problem with businesses and maybe the board or the C-suite saying, we need to do AI, find something to do. And that often doesn't translate into something that's really highly valuable. But I think it's definitely like more common and happening more these days.
Starting to get more. We've just responded to a tender, which was really interesting. The tender came out and it had a fixed price requirement with a business metric of like 80% accuracy. And against these business metrics, which it's a computer vision problem, and going back And then they've got a bonus. If you get to 90%, you get another
Mhm.
bonus. And if you get 95%, there's another bonus.
I like it.
I think it's really heading in the right way, right?
Yeah.
They've started off thinking about what's the requirement for performance of this system
Yeah.
from a business metric point of view.
Yeah.
Which we then have to translate back into our object tracking model. What does it need to
Mhm.
do, and other things like that. But I think that's that business is starting to get more sophisticated in their thinking, right?
Yeah. And I think if you look at, I mean, there's been a lot of articles come out in the last year or so. A friend of ours, Evan Shellshare, has sort of put a book together with a lot of different accounts.
Yeah, we had
about
Evan on a previous podcast.
There you go. And he, a lot of insights from him, and I've seen other, I guess papers and books released recently. But generally, his book is 80% of data science projects fail. I've seen similar numbers, around the place.
Yep.
And when you really drill it down, a lot of the time, it's just not solving the right problems and not making sure that it's bringing real value and getting integrated in the business. And it's the same story for years now, and I think there's still a lot. I think with generative AI too, because it's a general sort of tool that can be used in different ways. A forecasting problem, hey, I need to hit this number. It's a bit more well defined and narrow. I think with generative AI, it's easier to be lazy in defining business value and what are we actually trying to achieve, and then how do we actually track that we're getting that value when we go to production, especially for like chatbot style use cases and language use cases. It's quite tricky to actually quantify the value a lot of the time. It's something I know a lot of companies are challenged with.
Cool. Today I wanted to chat with you a bit about there's been some recent announcements. I think the developer conference is a whole lot of new stuff in Azure AI Foundry. Azure AI Foundry was really released the end of last year, right, in sort of November-ish last year. And it's really stitching together a bit more of the orchestration. Wanted to chat about that, particularly around the building trusted and reliable AI models, sort of what components are starting to emerge there in the tool chain, and that broader discussion about building systems, regardless of what framework you're using. What are those sort of components that are really adding value? Wanted to dive in there. So any updates on AI Foundry and things like that?
So I guess, like you said, the Microsoft Build Conference just happened a couple of weeks ago. So the Build Conference is the yearly developer conference. So usually all the product group teams at Microsoft are sort of rushing to release a new swath of features and products at this time of year. So there's just been a big batch of new upgrades, and I think just AI Foundry, anyone who's sort of familiar with cloud, there's generally 100 different types of resources or services in the cloud, and software's, you're playing Lego to plug things together and build a solution. AI Foundry is really trying to bring a lot of that together, and it's actually quite challenging. A lot of the challenges, I guess, that teams have had in building these solutions is trying to plug evaluation and different bits together. It takes time, right? And I think, and that's generally why a lot of teams skip it or don't do it as well as they should. Even last year at the Build Conference, some of these fundamental services were released and upgraded, but it wasn't as cohesive, maybe, and easy just to sort of tick boxes and say, yep, I want this turned on. Tracing, sure, add it, and it automatically flows through. One thing, I know I'm a Microsoft employee, but even just as a general software engineer, one thing that I think this year was really clear was just how much more integrated the sort of Azure platform is becoming. And it's happening across the industry as well. Most providers are getting more mature and really building that integration to make it easier just to stand stuff up quickly and match how quickly you want to release use cases. But it definitely feels with this batch of changes, we've had the evaluation service for a while, but it's just so much easier now to just turn it on. Both offline evaluation, online, during the conversation. So I guess if you look at what's been released and some of the new things, I think everything at the moment is agentic, obviously. It's all the rage, and now not just having chat use cases, but now, having more workflows, giving these agents tools that they can execute. That actually brings a whole nother can of worms when it comes to reliability, security. You now have to make sure that these agents are now, you know, in the same way that you'd build software with microservices where you set up the networking so that things can only access what they want, and identities so that they can't go and, you know, do things that they shouldn't be doing. You know, a lot more of the product now is supporting that. Agents now, you know, the agent service, each agent has an identity, and you can, you know, scope, you know, principles of least privilege for these agents. So it's just getting a lot more mature and sort of catching up to how we traditionally build robust software. A lot of that same tooling now is there for the agentic world. You know, easier integration with things like A2A, which is the agent to agent protocol, so that agents can talk to each other, MCP, stuff like that. So I guess, you know, any thoughts on that? Or
well, let's kick off with, like, let's say a RAG app, and then switch over to, well, what might change when we go to an agentic type model, because obviously introducing that, you know, getting the protocol exchange right is going to be quite critical, right, in terms of, you know, that interpretation the AI model is doing to actually do the API integration. But in a RAG model, you know, if we think about that and the way evals are used, you know, someone writes a chatbot, they build an eval on the front, and the first thing is almost like an acceptance test. I put in my prompt, am I getting back the right answer, right? So a lot of people I've found, they just start out doing that manually, but really my experience, and you might have the shared experience about starting to introduce automation in there, because it's very much an iterative and a repetitive task as you're really exploring that, right?
Yeah, for sure. I guess if you think about RAG chatbots, most of them, a way I like to think about it is often, like, if you think about what's the difference between a RAG chatbot and an agent, is I think of RAG chatbots often as read-only, right? Something that I chat with. You know, agent is really about having agency and going and doing things, right? So technically, you know, I mean, there's 100 different definitions of agent, but when I think about what an agent is, it's really about starting to act.
You 3,000 holidays in Italy.
Exactly. Although I do love holidays in Italy. But I think it's more about, you know, if we go from a RAG chatbot, it's fairly easy to control. Like, the main issue you've got to be careful with is, obviously there's security issues. You don't want to give access to the wrong people. But when it comes to how is that user interacting with it, and what's the blast radius, if it gives the wrong, hallucinates or does the wrong thing, you know, a lot of that is just, you know, checking, all right, are we retrieving the right information? Which is actually often the hardest and tricky, the most important step for RAG is getting the right context. And then making sure that when it gives that back to the user, you know, maybe doing some checks to make sure, all right, is this faithful to the context that was retrieved? Was the right context retrieved? And then also training the user and making them understand, you really need to check this and, you know, look at it, you know, I guess be careful and know that they can make simple mistakes. As you start to look at agents, you know, now it's about, you know, making sure that it's, you know, you're not just looking at like retrieval and does this text response make sense, but now you're thinking, all right, is it using tools correctly? You know, when it uses those tools, like, is it using that response in the right way? And it gets a lot, it's not just a synchronous task where I'm chatting with something at the same time, but now it's potentially something that runs over hours. So you've got multiple steps in workflows. Maybe you have to check how agents talk to each other. And as we look at these agent to agent protocols, maybe it's not just an agent calling an API that's deterministic. Now I've maybe got an agent talking to another agent, and both of them are non-deterministic. So it starts to get really, really tricky.
It does, and I think from I'm come from that test QA engineer. You know, I started writing test scaffolding for fighter planes back in the 90s, right? To do exactly that. We're still doing the stuff, you know, that's exactly what we need now as well, right? Because just having a bit of monkey testing, or even, you know, there is some support for manual testing and things like that in the framework, but pretty much to do it at scale and with reliability, you need to start building up the scaffolding. So the AI Foundry framework provides the evals out of the box for doing a lot of those basic tests, right? Like content evaluations about whether it's safe content and things like that. Similarity matches, because again, when it comes back with a chat response, it's not going to be the same thing. So is this it not commissioning a whole bunch of new things, or is it you know, does it rely on the information provided in its context? But then, like you said, you raised the issue about the retrieval bit, and that's when you really want to start thinking about your almost integration test. I don't just want to look at the end result. I actually want to open up the covers and actually look at what's being retrieved there and maybe tune that bit as well. Is that because I think there's been a few discussions that retrieval bit requires quite a bit of tuning, right?
Yeah, and this is the thing, when an agent's main way of communicating is text, it's not a binary thing, which is really easy to test.
No.
It becomes really hard to do it as a human, right?
Yeah.
So you've got to start thinking about automation. I mean, pretty much everything these days when it comes to evaluating LLMs, like using another LLM as a judge, is really the only way you can do it at scale and repeatedly. But one thing that I think is always important, and this is not just generative AI, but machine learning, is thinking about, do I have a test set, and developing that upfront. I think one of the mistakes that I see a lot with different customers is, these generative AI models are general, right? And so if you think about a customer service context, it could be having to field questions, across many different parts of the business. Maybe it's billing, maybe it's product questions, or, it could be lots of different things, right? And I think a lot of the time, teams may not set up sufficient testing, or they'll eyeball it across 20 examples that their team wrote down, rather than them going and sampling. All right, let's look at the last year of emails. How do we break that down and go, all right, well, actually 40% of that is in this area, 20% here. Your test set should really be a little microcosm of real data. And I think a lot of teams don't actually go, hey, we've actually got like 10 years of customer service data. Let's farm that and let's do some analysis. This is the data science part. Let's go analyze and say, right, which are the ones that didn't get resolved straight up, or maybe they didn't get resolved, but then they got fixed. Like, what are the areas that have the largest rate of things going wrong, and maybe oversample those so they're more prominent in your data set. Because what you'll find is that, once you get your system up and running and humming, to eke out additional performance and get it more accurate, because the answers are fuzzy, it's often hard to see differences when you change to a different model, change a prompt. And so having a good test set and really thinking about, how do I evaluate this so that it really reflects what I see in production is really important. And it's actually a really common problem I see. A lot of teams, they go to production and realize, people are actually using this quite differently to what we thought. And we didn't really test this area that people are using it a lot for. And errors there are actually really costly. So I think that's one thing, doing the right setup at the start. And I think that's something that a lot of teams miss. But
because traditionally in testing there'd be like coverage metrics and things like that you'd have, and you sort of design, you work on that design to sort of explore those things. I don't think distributions are well understood yet by people in data, and what might that look like in the visual space or the text space. But that's something we've definitely got to get our heads around. But interesting on that side. So when you think about what are the tests you should run and the prompts you should generate, there is some stuff in there like the automated red teaming stuff, right? That will generate examples and more or less transform your data to more adversarial sort of scenarios, and that's probably could be quite powerful, right? So,
for sure. So if you in the evaluation service in Azure, you can use that standalone and sort of give it, here's 100 responses, here's what I wanted, here's what came out, like evaluate it for me. Often it's things on a scale of 1 to 5, some of the metrics you talked about earlier. But now, red teaming is something that a lot of teams just never did because it's quite challenging. But there's libraries like Pyrite or Pirate. In Azure now, you can actually, there's sort of
integrated in now.
Exactly. So you can sort of point it, especially if you build your sort of service in the agent service or within Azure, you can basically just point it at an endpoint and say, hey, I want to run a red team exercise. Here's the categories I'm concerned about. Maybe it's violence, maybe it's certain, jailbreaking, certain types of jailbreaking. Tick those boxes, hit run, and it will automatically run, hundreds of different prompts and different jailbreak techniques, often quite advanced, like multi-step techniques, which is often, advanced attackers, it's multi-step. And basically give you a report. And the really nice thing, and one of the things that was just released at Build, is now having, GitHub Actions that can do this for you automatically. So whenever you've got to change the code base that maybe changes the model type, as part part of your CI/CD flow, you can run this GitHub action. It can automatically use the evaluation service. It deploys, uses the evaluation service to run hundreds of examples, whether it's your test set or or like a red teaming, using like open source databases of different attack vectors, and then basically give you that report and say, hey, here's the old version, or here's the green version, what's running, here's the new version, and sort of show you and give you distributions and say, look, is this different? Is it statistically significant? So it's, which, as an engineer, it's knowing the tools are there is fine, but it's easy to go, well, it's a bit of work, I can't get this done. But when it's so easy and it's really just about plugging things in, that's where it really gets adopted.
And someone's done that work to think through all those different scenarios. But,
exactly.
And what you will still find, right, that people do their own custom evals, their custom LLM judges, but equally, we've found on a bunch of projects, is using LLMs to do that data data generation for those scenarios, right? So we'll see, I think, more of that emerging where people have put the effort into creating patterns that you can reuse rather than you having to think through, how do I start sort of creating the different scenarios in this? But I think that'll be something more and more that's explored around that side.
Yeah, and I think that there's been some really good papers, for this. It's definitely a lot out there in open source, but that's the thing, trying to generate these test sets or sort of agent profiles or characters to sort of take on a role and test something. It's evolving really quickly.
Cool. So looking at those evals, so what does the evals look like when we're dealing with agentic? We're starting to deal with these APIs and
that's it. So a lot of it is, there's obviously, when you're dealing with RAG, it's making sure that what's going in and out of the model isn't offensive or the wrong sort of content. So basic sort of stuff that's been around for a while with any sort of chatbot context for years. Obviously then once you add retrieval accuracy and faithfulness, that it's using that context. Now as we move to agents, when they're starting to, and also jailbreak protection as well. So within Azure, the content safety service, it's not just the sort of basic things of checking the content, but and multimodal content as well for images, but also making sure someone's not attempting to jailbreak it, or that the context is being retrieved doesn't have jailbreak content in it as well. So these are some of the things we've got there. Copyright protection is another area. As we start to look at agents, now it's about you're starting to look a little bit more like software with the things you need to test. Can it use tools effectively? So there's been a few tool use leaderboards out open source for quite a while, but for a lot of in a lot of areas, tool use is really, really important, especially when you're trying to automate long workflows. So is the tool actually using, is the agent using those tools effectively? Is it calling the, using the right parameters when it comes to calling those tools, selecting the right tools? And then is it also, if it gets some variables that are not correct, or maybe it's giving negative values when the API should, or the tool should only accept something 0 or larger. Can it actually figure out, hang on, that's actually invalid, and be able to deal with that and maybe give something back to the user? So that's where, and again, the framework for testing this is actually still pretty similar. It's just an extra suite of types.
So we're starting to get exposure of that API so we can see what's coming in the other end and sort of functionally validate the back
Exactly. And I guess just one more thing on that note is that if you think about testing large language models and applications built with large language models, one thing that's good to see is, I think for a little while there, testing and evaluation of LLM-based systems wasn't really very inspired by software testing, which is a bit frustrating. And it's more and more, it's starting to look a lot more like how you just build software, which is how it should be tested. And the idea that, unit testing. So instead of trying to just build this whole system and do functional tests and eyeballing it, starting to go, right, let's test individual parts of the system. Let's break it down.
Used to a big system of stubbing out, those objects and things like that.
Exactly. And so starting to go, all right, maybe you've got a system that first needs to, maybe it's a chatbot, and the first step is, all right, well, what's the intent? What do you want to do before it selects which agent to give it to? Well, let's test that on its own. And then we'll test the next bit on its own. And, trying to optimize these systems, non-deterministic deterministic systems is hard enough.
Yep.
But if you don't break things down into different steps and, test those individually, it's impossible to optimize a whole system. So thankfully, not just the tooling, but also I think just the industry is now moving back towards how we build software, which is breaking things down and into steps so that we can actually do it more effectively.
Because we've found traditionally in the industry is that, when you're working on projects, let's say for a government department as a project, they don't tend to invest in that infrastructure for longer term, even though that software is probably going to be there for 25 years, right? But if you work for a products company, then they do invest in that.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting now where LLMs are almost so bespoke to the customer that they really need to think of it as that's a product of their company, not just a project sort of thing. It'll be interesting to see whether we see people make that shift where, actually, I've got a lifetime of 20 years following this development thing. So if I don't invest here, I've got a really lot of technical debt.
And I think too, like when I build one agent that can use tools, can retrieve context from a database or can use MCP tools. When everything becomes agents and MCPs, obviously we play it out over a number of years, maybe not that many. It's now less about an individual use case. And now, there's a lot more value and emphasis on building out a platform of tooling because at the end of the day, the way I build this first use case might be the same way I build it for the next 100. So maybe, hopefully it will incentivize companies and teams to go, you know what, we actually get a lot of value. If we do it right for this one project, we do it many, many times. And maybe they're less likely to take shortcuts because you can solve so many different problems with agents and you'll be able to. Maybe that'll make people think more deeply about it.
Yeah,
so,
cool.
Especially,
there's probably another conversation down the track is on the testing side, we're seeing a lot of AI tooling in that space, which, if you had scripts running on your front end, they're always so brittle, right? That if you change things, but now AI is sort of saying, it can be self-resilient and things like that, right? But, so it'll be interesting to see where that morphs together over time to give that scalability as well. But that's another conversation, perhaps.
Well, it's an interesting one. You probably have more insight than I do there. But even with like the computer use agent from OpenAI, that Anthropic, they're all sort of releasing these, and these models are basically taking pictures of what's on the screen in the UI, deciding what to do, clicking on things, and it's starting to look very much like functional testing of UIs.
UI path or something like that.
Yeah. So how do we? Hopefully, we can actually use those same approaches.
I think we'll see the convergence. I think.
But
another longish conversation in that space. So a lot of what we've chatted about is how to build an application that you can trust, but then how does this sort of cross over to then you're pushing it out in a production, continuous monitoring? How does some of that stuff sort of feed into monitoring, or is the AI Foundry stuff sort of adding in other things into monitoring that's sort of helping on that front?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, for anyone with a background in machine learning, it's really rounding things out into the way that good machine learning systems, so monitoring, especially if you've got users in the loop as well, or different data that's coming in. Maybe you're processing documents and formats are changing over time. It's not just a couple, values. You've got like images and things like that. So a wide distribution of possible things that it needs to handle. It's not just about, you've got to monitor how is this being used. So how are users using it? What's the sort of data that's coming in? So does that match what we expected with the initial tests that we did before we released it in our offline testing? You then want to track, obviously all the same metrics that you test, making sure it's behaving as it should, it's calling the right tools and acting appropriately, right? But doing that online, instead of just being able to run it once, collect the answers and run some tests over it, now there's this whole tracing and instrumentation that you need to do. That's actually been a little bit challenging for a lot of implementations that I've seen. And it may be one thing just to collect, here where the messages going back and forth. But then once you add in tool use, once you add in long running processes, and maybe you're calling different things and you need to pull the metrics in from this other service I've got so that it's all one cohesive list, it gets a little bit tricky. one thing that's really nice within the Azure Agent Service is, you know, if you build something and use the sort of Foundry SDK to build, or the inference SDK, you can basically just say, here's my instrumentation key to start logging. And that's literally it. That's all you need. As long as the resource is there and you know, it can connect and log, it'll all just show up and it just works, which, having had to do this, you know, manually, it's like, there's just not really, it's hard for me to recommend to go do something custom. You know, even things like Langfuse and stuff like that, you can absolutely run that on Azure, but it's just so easy now with the tracing in Azure. And I think one other thing is, as these applications are less on their own, and now they're starting to call traditional software, or maybe they're calling into Microsoft 365 to you know, grab something out of SharePoint or an Excel document or something like that. Now these systems are coming much more integrated and reaching out into other areas. Having a bespoke testing, a bespoke tracing system that's just for your LLM, it starts to break down, because a lot of the stuff that's happening is actually outside of that system. And so that's where having a system that integrates across the rest of the stack and everything that your agent might touch just makes it so much easier to bring it all into one place, have a correlation ID that you know, encompasses everything, and see the full flow through of exactly what happens. It just becomes, you know, as someone who likes to write code and build stuff myself, it becomes a lot harder to justify going off and building something myself when it's going to be, you know, a lot harder to maintain and integrate. It's easy to use something, you know, out of the box.
So some of the plugins as well are for things like you know, privacy, de-identification, things like that. So that would be key as well in that sort of continuous monitoring, right? If we're turning on tracing with,
for sure,
you know, user production data, then there
making
needs
sure
to be
that things
something
aren't
built
leaking
into that in terms of you know, they've consented to that data, plus, you know, if there is PII or something like that in there, you know, maybe how that's managed. But there are some sort of out of the box sort of PII things.
There are. And even, you know, making sure what should be logged or not. And then when it's tested and results come back, making sure that none of that leaks through. It's quite a common thing, actually, especially in like financial services. Having that integration where it is easy to de-identify things and store it, and also user feedback as well. That's another thing. When at the end of a conversation or an interaction that a user might have with a system, you know, being able to log the feedback, maybe it's thumbs up, thumbs down, maybe it's a rating,
sentiment analysis on that.
And then making it easy to sort of, all right, show me the average for the last 7 days or for each deployment, and being able to not just track it before you deployed and then maybe in a CI/CD pipeline, but also getting user feedback and just having it all pulled together, so it's easy to compare A versus B.
Oh, cool. We might just slightly change. The other part is obviously guardrails are built into the Foundry as well. How do you see guardrails sitting in this architecture? I mean, what are you seeing is in the implementation patterns and things like that?
I mean, look, this is something where like Azure Content Safety, so it's got a number of features with, you know, we talked about jailbreak protection, you know, making sure, you know, a lot of guardrails, there's a few different things you can do. And what you find actually recently is, you know, some of the newer models, there's been a general trend for when these models are trained, particularly your, you know, closed source models, so models from Anthropic, Google or OpenAI, they're trained with a level of you know, adherence and good behavior built in. What we're actually seeing is some of these models are now becoming, I guess, it's less built into the model. So with some new releases, you know, we've had some customers complain and say, oh, well, look, the model now can be jailbroken or do something I don't want it to do. Now there's a bit more onus on making sure that you've got, you know, you want the model to be capable to do what you want it to do. And then you use things like Azure Content Safety and other tools, good prompts, to then scope down what you know, and get the model to behave in the way you want. So I think there is more responsibility now for builders to make sure they're thinking about this. Within Azure, the Content Safety service, it's got a bunch of tooling around, you know, on the fly, you know, being able to detect and sort of, you know, get the raw response from the model, and then check it with, you know, classifiers to check, okay, is this, you know, does this, you know, tick the boxes when it comes to thresholds of how likely something is to be an issue on certain areas, like maybe talking about violence or hate speech or sexual themes or stuff like that. You can also have custom classifiers as well, which is quite cool. So one of the cool things you can do in the content safety service is actually either give it a data set of data to say, hey, I want you to classify this, and essentially this category, I want you to actually intercept it, and before it goes back to the user, say, hey, this is actually triggers this custom category that you set up. So you can do it with your own training data, or you can actually even just give it a prompt. And so instead of having to put it in the prompt of your model, you can have it in the content safety service, and then actually use an LLM to do the classification. So you don't need any training data, which is actually really cool. And then obviously when you build your application, if something has been flagged, you then sort of intercept that before the user and say, hey, this is off, or maybe change what the prompt would have been. That's and then resend it and sort of sanitize along the way.
So you can have those injected validation points even at each API interface that you've got, sort of go, hey, does this sort of response back matching sort of what we're asking for and things like that? So interesting. One of the cases the guys were talking about is those custom sort of guardrails. So one of the things they were working on, which we're finding on another application, the ability for how good LLMs now are becoming at writing code, to generate, say, database queries against database, a bit like in the medical stuff. Can we get the clinicians where they can write a time series type query about the patient record and get some response back? So, this is like generating SQL code on the schema and producing the code and that visibility. But one of the example the guys were giving is they're doing this, from a almost like Power BI interface, but then they're querying BigQuery. But one of the guardrails is actually, let's ask BigQuery about the cost of this, because if it's going to be $200, we don't want to be, letting people just pump in $200 queries, one after another sort of thing. So it's interesting, those sort of design of those guardrails and those tests there that you start sort of really architecting.
That's really fascinating. And that's the thing, as these systems become more integrated, it's not just a chatbot. It's now acting in other systems. It's a little bit of a nightmare.
Really building a multi-agent sort of element thing, right? It's
and trying to make sure that's the thing, and even code, maybe you're also wanting to make sure that it's not, you're basically using standard code testing, things like SNCC or something like that, to actually check it before it executes. So it's going to have to get a lot more comprehensive, a lot more advanced. I think the models and we will plug them in and integrate them with software much faster than we can figure out the good tooling to actually do on the fly evaluation and guardrails. So
I think we're getting so fast at integrating, and that sort of bit's being solved now. It's what's the patterns and everything, we start tooling around it.
That's it.
Confidence.
I mean, in a lot of ways, that's the story of civilization, right? We sort of make mistakes and then figure, we better do that now.
We've built a fire and now we're blowing up the steam engine or something like that, right?
That's it. So, but I think more and more of I think there'll be more jobs, more space, and greater need for people in organizations to really think deeply about this and start to also break down, all right, well, how do we already do this? A lot of the processes that these agents are doing are already human processes. There's a big importance of making sure you codify, right, what are the checks and balances that are here, making them explicit so that you can tell the model what to do and what not to do, but then also building the right frameworks to do the evaluation and sort of in-flight checking and testing, and they're not just going off and doing it. And
we're really just shifting work up, because we used to spend so much time on ETL and all this stuff, right? And now we're sort of saying, well, the tool's looking after a lot more of that. Now we just really want to focus on the end result and make sure that's got the behavior we're expecting.
It's more about engineering the system. It's like a meta game now, and we're going up the stack one layer, and it's less about doing it ourselves and more about, right, how do we build the platform or choose the right platform to make it so we can iterate really quickly and integrate. It's interesting.
So exciting times. What do you think next year or two? What's industry going to move ahead with, you think? There's still a lot of early adopters there, right? So it's,
I think so. I think there's still a big gap between what you see in open source and new, there's new protocols being created. I think, even if you look at something like MCP, right? And I think that was announced, I think it was October or November by Anthropic, and largely MCP when it was released, and even still now to an extent, or was really about, I run something locally, there's only a single user of this MCP server, and it's really just for me to help my my Anthropic app interact with other things on my system. Now, as we start to look at things acting in the cloud with many to many, one agent serving many requests or one tool, you have to start to think about authentication and things like that, which isn't really in the MCP protocol much. So I think there's still a big gap between some of the things that have been announced, and then how do we get this into an enterprise, where it's hardened, where it actually works, where it's scalable, and it's like there's still a big gap. So a lot of the stuff that's being announced, people get excited, but to actually make that work, particularly from a security perspective, it's a lot of the stuff that's getting announced is still missing a lot of the things that, if you look at the same version of that in, so for example, Azure API management and service mesh and things like that, that handle, networking for you, handle short-lived tokens and authentication. I know Azure API management has now released, a lot of things to actually make MCP servers work and be able to do those things now. There's a bit of a catch-up game to take an idea or a protocol and actually turn it into something that works and you can scale and it integrates and everything. So I think I don't know, the next couple of years, honestly, I think it's all going to be about integration. I think it's all going to be about having agents that can are interoperable, work with each other, and a sort of, we're breaking problems down a lot more about workflows, long running tasks. I think there'll need to be a lot more about human in the loop and management planes to actually manage many agents doing different things and bring their far-reaching tentacles where they're touching different systems together and have the right checks and balances. So it's a little bit scary if you mess it up, but I don't know. I think the tooling is getting a lot better at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. One of our customers, they're sort of like content distribution, and they want to modernize because the market they're in is moving very rapidly down that. And part of it is also we've got to do a bit of a legacy uplift on some of the back end, things like having a bit of more modern data lake architecture and stuff so they can orchestrate. But, that was sort of Christmas time. We're sort of saying, well, agentic is quite bleeding edge, so let's get this bit sorted. But it's really advanced quickly, right? So, and it's almost, you start considering and pondering, well, we're looking at all the data lake stuff because we want that integration, but will we start seeing almost like leapfrogging that the agentic stuff might also give us, that visibility into the legacy stuff. Give us that linkage. It's really tricky to keep up, but super interesting. But again, thinking about where do they want to get to in terms of the business delivery, right? That's probably more going to drive what bits we need to pull on and what's mature enough in that situation.
Yeah, and it's a really, there's always been this thing about, do you build something from scratch because it doesn't exist yet? For example, your cloud provider, whether it's Microsoft or AWS or GCP, it's like, all right, they might release a service in a year. Do I build it now and get the benefit? Maybe it'll be better. But now it's like, even, for example, if you look at RAG, right, retrieval from my vector database. So Azure AI Search has had actually been probably the most or one of the most advanced options for RAG database in the market. Like it's got keyword and vector search, it's got re-ranking. It's now also got agentic retrieval. So you can actually, one thing I found with a few customers, when you get to some really high value and difficult use cases. So imagine you're a financial advisor and someone's asked you quite a complex question about, I want to pull out my super, but the last two or 3 years I've had these contributions. I'm also on this benefit or XYZ. You probably need to send off 4 or 5 different retrieval requests. You can't just send the whole thing and hope to get all the right information from these different areas. And so that's, building an agent to break something down and go, right, give me multiple bits of context, bring them together. There are teams that have built that and open source versions of that. You can now just get that in AI search and it, for complex queries, the accuracy is way higher. And there's a lot more situations now where you go, you know what, I don't actually think it makes sense to build this. Let's just wait 3 months or 6
Yeah,
months.
yeah.
So it's I think, I think for a lot of teams and businesses, they need to go, well, what's our core competency? Where do we want to build, and where do we, and I guess it's really valuable to have someone on the team who's looking at what's coming out in industry and going, right, what do we actually put the 3 to 6 months into, or what do we just wait for the industry and the cloud providers to just release it? Because it's quite tricky to build this stuff and have it work. Or like natural language to SQL, where I want to query a database. Do you go fine tune a model to take natural language and turn it into SQL query and do the work on your schemas to make sure it all works? Or
somebody will be working on solving that problem.
Totally. And it's just a Postgres plugin now, and I just have to deploy some model, or I just use this OpenAI, and now it just works. So I think there's more and more of those questions, and that's where I think choosing the right platform is becoming more important to make sure you've got access to the newest innovations.
That's right.
As they come out,
a bit more open and it can be. It's got that incremental add-on.
That's it.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks, mate. Lots of good stuff to chat about there. So look, a bit of a wrap up. That's it for today's episode. To our audience, if you found this discussion valuable, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your network. KJR is committed to helping organisations navigate AI adoption with confidence. So if you're looking for expert guidance, you can contact us via our website, kjr.com.au, and find the link in the description. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Michael. That was really enjoyed the conversation. I'd like to chat a lot more and definitely get you back for another conversation in the future. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kelvin. Thanks.